Good morning and good evening, and welcome to our GW Institute for Korean Studies Korean Policy Forum this morning. If you're joining from the evening time zones, welcome as well. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs at the George Washington University and am a core member of the GW Institute for Korean Studies. This summer, I will be taking over as director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies. It's my great honor today to welcome sort of a dream team of commentators about last week's South Korean elections. And I'll begin by briefly introducing all four of our speakers and then turning it over to them for some commentary. So our first speaker today is Chung-eun Lee. She is the Deputy Managing Director of the newsroom at Donga-ilbo, which is one of South Korea's largest newspapers, and she previously served as Washington correspondent. She brings a great deal of experience, and I'm very glad to welcome you to our panel today. Our second speaker for the day will be Hee-jun Kim, who is the head of the International News Department at YTN, which is a news channel in Korea. And she also brings a wealth of experience, including also Washington correspondent a little bit earlier than Chung-eun. Welcome as well to our panel today. Our third presenter is Tim Martin, who is the Korea bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and has been there for almost 8 years now, I guess. So I'm very pleased to welcome him for a journalist's perspective on what happened last week. And then last but not least, Josh Rogin is the columnist for the Global Opinions section of the Washington Post. And he has written extensively and commentated extensively on foreign policy and national security issues. So it's also my great pleasure to welcome you to this panel today. So for the audience who's joining us online, let me offer one reminder. Please, as the presenters are speaking, if you have any questions for the Q&A that we'll have at the end of the presentations, please enter them in the Q&A box, not in the chat function. And I will be taking questions and moderating that discussion. Otherwise, let me dive right into our discussion to try to understand the elections from last week. So let me begin with Chung-eun. I'd like to hear your perspective a little bit on what the main political parties' strategies were, what some of the challenges were leading up to the elections, and we can even cover issues as diverse as handbags and green onions in this discussion. What was the preparation like for these elections, and what were some of the strategies and challenges that the main political parties faced? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. First, let me explain the result of outcome of the result. The ruling People Power Party, PPP, gained 108 seats out of 300, crushing defeat. On the contrary, the main opposition Democratic Party, DP, and other liberal parties got 192 in total, sweeping far more than the majority. I would rather say a landslide victory for the opposition parties. So let me show you the cartogram. This is the peninsula, the South Korea, and then you see the red conservative wave here. And then the liberal, the blue wave here, the portion is much bigger here. So this is the outcome. So you can see the picture in your mind. So let me explain. The election is widely seen as a midterm referendum, perceived as the midterm judgment on President Yoon Suk-yeol. In my opinion, many of Yoon's policies are on the right track. For example, policies in national security, industry support, and labor reform. However, people's anger and disappointment about problems such as high cost of living, expensive housing prices, were quite serious. And voters want to demonstrate it to the incumbent president. Plus, President Yoon had been criticized for his lack of communication. No interview, no press conference with domestic media outlets. And his governing style is very tough, pushing through one-way policies regardless of public concerns. So some people perceived him as, let's say, arrogant or stubborn. People complained that President Yoon, the former prosecutor general, treated many issues and even person as if they were under investigation. His supporting rate has been quite low in mid 30s. Then some scandals pops up just a few weeks or months before the election. For example, First Lady's luxury bag scandal was a critical blow. There was a spy camera footage that First Lady Kim Gun-hee accepted a Dior bag from a pastor. And when it was revealed through YouTube channel, she was criticized as accepting bribery rather than a gift. Another thing, one of President Yoon's secretary had to step down for his threatening remarks to the critical TV network MBC amid the harsh criticism that he tried to suffocate the freedom of the press. Another deteriorating factor was President Yoon's controversial decision to appoint the former Defense Minister Lee Jong-sop as the ambassador to Australia. Former Defense Minister Lee was amid allegations of interfering on military investigation illegally into Marine's death last year, and he had to resign in less than a month because of the harsh public criticism. One last thing I would add, Yoon's aggressive medical reform, mainly his plan to increase 2,000 more doctors a year, has led angry doctors to walk off the job. Hospitals are now laying off doctors who would do the surgery. So the suffering patients turn their backs from Yoon administration. So this would be another factor which was very unfavorable for the ruling party. So the strategies, the ruling party had to pled to the voters to give just one more opportunity. And they promised that they would do better if they win the election. The ruling party promised to lower taxes, give more financial aids to the companies and households, and lift regulations, build new bridges, and so on and on and on. Whereas the opposition Democratic Party, DP, used every aspect of Yoon administration's weakness, attacking policies from the high grocery price, mainly the green onion again. So the main campaign message was, I would rather say, judgment, pleading the voters to show people's power to deliver the judgment and punishment on President Yoon. And DP also promised to pay for about $200 cash to every single person in this country. It was criticized as populism, but DP didn't care. So the election result is what you see now. These are some briefings about the election. Back to you, Professor Arrington.
Thank you very much. Can I ask one follow-up question briefly? So the DP lost a few seats in this election. It was at 180 previously, Ms. Dowd, and now to, I believe, 175 or 6.
Yes, alone, DP alone, yes.
Yeah, DP alone. So the main opposition party, center-left.
Party is all up to 192.
Yeah, so for the DP, you mentioned that they had this policy of $200 per person. Were there other sort of positive or constructive policy proposals from the DP, or do you think that the voters also punished a little bit the DP? Can we interpret that decline in the number of seats as a little bit frustration with mostly the People's Power Party, the ruling party, but a little bit also with the DP?
Oh, well, actually, for me, this election is unprecedentedly chaotic. There are so many toxic rhetorics, and I would rather say mudslinging something. Yeah, and then it's so bad words and shaming and then calling their names each other. So we cannot see or we cannot talk much about policies itself actually. So they are like condemning each other and then mudsliding each other, things like that. But I would rather say that, so what will the political landscape from now on? Actually, that would be more important, I think. As the PPP failed to regain the majority, it would be difficult to legislate bills to support the government policies, actually. And the DP and other liberal parties altogether secured almost 2/3 of the total seats. It would grant them enough legislative power to weaken Yoon's policy agendas. The DP would push special prosecutors' investigation on all controversial charges of Yoon and his staff and his first lady. Some of the hardliners in the DP and other opposition parties have voted to enact a special prosecution law against the first lady to investigate her allegations of stock manipulation. Actually, it was even before President Yoon got married. Anyway, this would be another hard blow to Yoon. So I would rather say that these will put him, President Yoon, in lame duck situation. Some even call it dead duck. So it is possible that President Yoon would lose his momentum to lead the crucial policy agendas. And even there are some concerns that the administrative system would be de facto paralyzed. So I would say that Yoon now faces serious post-election challenges under huge pressure to do more cooperation and compromise with the other opposition parties. So we are now watching and waiting how he would handle this situation. And the first litmus test would be who he will appoint the new prime minister and new chief of staff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this question of whether the chaos and the mudslinging, as you described the election, is going to continue to characterize politics going forward, or whether the parties can somehow find compromises on some issues to actually pass legislation in the coming months is going to be a big question. So let me turn now to Hee-jun. Thank you very much, Chung-eun, for your commentary. We'll come back to you in the roundtable portion. So my first question for you is, what do you think the potential impacts of the election results are going to be on Seoul's foreign policy and security policy? Historically, the People's Power Party has really emphasized a hardline approach to North Korea, and both the DP and the People's Power Party are elevating Korea's contributions to the export of military equipment and things like that. So on the other hand, the DP favors a more of an engagement approach with North Korea, but they are not in charge of the presidency right now. So what does this bode for foreign policy and security policy, maybe inter-Korean affairs, as well as trilateral cooperation between Korea, Japan, and the United States, which has moved forward under the Yoon administration so far?
Okay, thanks for having me. Actually, regarding the potential impact on Yoon government's foreign and security policies, there are a few perspectives to consider. One view is that the election result may not greatly affect the government's pursuit of its diplomatic policies. This is because the Yoon administration started with low approval ratings and a minority government situation from the outset. However, there is also the perspective that the government's defeat will significantly impact its foreign policy repositioning. The opposition party that achieved a landslide victory is likely to try to constrain and criticize Yoon's foreign and security policies. I believe both of these views have valid points. It would be helpful to explore further the potential impact on key areas such as the ROK-US alliance, trilateral cooperation, etc. At first, how might the outcome of this election impact the ROK-US alliance, which is a core pillar of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region? President Yoon has made strengthening the ROK-US alliance one of his top foreign policy priorities, starting with his first summit with President Biden just 11 days after taking office in May 2022. From the DP's perspective, developing the Korean-US relationship into a comprehensive, mutually beneficial alliance is in line with the Yoon government's policies. Advancing the Korea-US alliance is also stated as a top priority in their general election platform. However, while the opposition party broadly agree with strengthening the alliance, they may continue to raise questions about the specific benefit for Korea. Regarding the Washington declarations, they dismissed it as not meaningfully different from previous summit agreement and the existing U.S. nuclear umbrella policies. Instead, they have demanded concrete solution for issues like the U.S. CHIPS Act and IRA. Thus, the opposition scrutiny is expected during the, for example, NCG operation or negotiations over defense cost sharings. Moreover, the DP has expressed skepticism toward deepening Korea-US-Japan trilateral cooperation. They criticize that strengthening the trilateral alliance has actually increased geopolitical risk on the Korean Peninsula. It is seen as part of effort to counter China, which has consequently worsened Korea-China relations. However, as all we know, the recent Camp David summit is considered to have taken trilateral cooperation to a new level. The first trilateral finance minister upcoming meeting in Washington signals the growing importance of the partnership in complex economic and financial challenges on the global stage. As maintaining Korea-US-Japan cooperation remains important, amidst North Korea's nuclear build-up and its closer ties with China and Russia, the Yoon government will need to make effort to persuade the opposition party and seek their cooperation going forward. Next, I would like to discuss the Korea-Japan relationship, which is a crucial component of the Trilateral Alliance. President Yoon Suk-yeol has strongly driven an effort to improve Korea-Japan relations. This stems from his firm conviction that the two countries should look beyond the historical issues that have hampered their ties in the past, and instead work toward a more future-oriented cooperative relationship. As part of this, the Korean government announced a resolution to the forced labor compensation issue in March last year. This paved the way for President Yoon's visit to Korea and a Korea-Japan summit, restoring high-level diplomatic exchange after 12 years hiatus and accelerating economic security cooperation. However, the DP has fiercely criticized this approach as submissive diplomacy. They have instead advocated for resolving pending historical issue based on fact and sincere apologies from Japan. I believe that the overall policy direction of Yoon's administration diplomacy toward Japan will not change significantly after this big defeat. The opposition's stance is expected to continue posing challenges. I want to go to the inter-Korean relationship. The ruling and opposition parties have significantly different policy orientation, especially when it comes to North Korea. The Yoon government's North Korea policy is focused on the denuclearization of North Korea, as well as human rights issue and the implementation of sanctions and pressures. On the other hand, the DP is emphasizing dialogue and exchange with North Korea. Their policy platform include building inter-Korean trust through the cooperation and providing humanitarian aid. Due to these conflicting policy directions, maintaining the Yoon government's firm stance on North Korea could face challenges. There is likely to be an ongoing political tug-of-war as the opposition calls for resuming dialogue, exchanges, and cooperation with the North. However, the North Korea has designated South Korea as an enemy and shut down all inter-Korean dialogue channels. Kim Jong-un is further solidified his nuclear capability while accelerating the ties with China and Russia. Accordingly, regardless of opposition criticism, the prospect for restarting substantive inter-Korean dialogue do not seem promising. Of course, the outcome of upcoming U.S. presidential election could be a variable for the future of inter-Korean relations, I think. Nonetheless, after North Korea's completion of its nuclear weapon program following the Hanoi summit, both the ruling and opposition parties in Seoul faced the demand to develop new and effective approach to the North Korea issues. Lastly, I would like to discuss how the Yoon's government China policy is likely to change after general election defeat. Under the Yoon government, the Korea-China bilateral ties have been marked more by conflict than cooperations. Tensions have been marked more by conflict than cooperation. Tensions have escalated due to China's economic retaliation measure and the rude remark made by the Chinese ambassador in Seoul. Moreover, President Yoon drew backlash from China by officially stating his oppositions to changing the status quo by force. Yoon has sought to take a more principled diplomacy approach, which China has criticized as anti-China diplomacy. In contrast, the DP emphasizes the importance of restoring friendly and cooperative Korea-China relations. During the election campaign, their party leader Lee Jae-myung criticized Yoon's China policy, saying Korea should just say thank you, shue, to China and not intervene in the China-Taiwan issues in order to pursue more pragmatic diplomacy. After the election defeat, the Yoon government will likely find it difficult to continue its hardline policy toward China. In fact, the Yoon administration have faced the burden of needing to manage the South Korea-China relations well over the remaining 3 years of his terms in order to secure economic and security benefit. In this context, there have been reports that a South Korea-China-Japan trilateral summit is being planned for the late May, which the presidential office has confirmed. If the trilateral summit does take place, the opposition may find it difficult to justify opposing it, as they advocate for enhanced cooperation with China. However, they could still scrutinize the substantive outcome of such a meeting. As time is up, I would like to wrap up my presentation here. I hope the following discussion can delve deeper into more detailed analysis. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you gave us a really nice breakdown of all of the different ways in which the opposition party, emboldened, can frustrate the Yoon administration's foreign policy and also provide points of scrutiny on that policy. I'd like to shift gears a little bit to Tim Martin and ask your perspective as a foreign correspondent in Seoul of these elections. What were some of the key takeaways? What were the main topics and issues that you and other foreign reporters were paying attention to in this election? So thank you.
Thanks for having me. This is one of the perennial issues for foreign correspondents, really anywhere around the world, where the main issues that people like me focus on for a local election that affects the South Korean, population are often much different than what, say, readers back in the U.S. might be concerned with. And principally, it's foreign policy. I mean, generally, if you walk around the streets before the election and you ask a regular South Korean what their views are on inter-Korean ties or what's Yoon's policy on China, they might not be following it that closely. But the coverage, especially from foreign media, often tilts in that direction. You get a lot of what's the read-through for North Korea? What's the read-through even for U.S. allies? If Yoon is seen as a lame duck, if he's seen as having weakened political power, and this is a point we made in our coverage, if his foreign policy approach was much different than his predecessors, is seen to have some type of expiration date. If there's doubt about who the next South Korean president might be in 2027, if it's a conservative like Yoon, or if it's another left-leaning candidate like Moon Jae-in, It could be Lee Jae-myung, it could be any number of people between now and then. So that could insert some doubt with both friends and foes. But I think if I look at across the landscape among foreign media, yeah, there was certainly a muted interest this legislative election versus the one 4 years ago. The one 4 years ago had this just wonderful global uniqueness to it. It was the first national election to be held during COVID-19. So I remember we did a very prominent story that followed some candidates. Like, how do you even pull this off? This was, the spring of 2020, just months into the pandemic. And I remember I followed one candidate who was snaking through these narrow alleyways of Seoul. And there was nobody on the street, but she was, on a truck and shouting out through her speakerphone or megaphone, excuse me, and saying, "I can't see you, but I can feel your heart. I can feel your warmth." So we had this sort of unique angle to not really write about local domestic issues, but really sort of justify why this mattered to a very global audience. I think we have to remind ourselves that we're in the year of elections. The US has certainly got a big one in November, but something like roughly half of the world's population, billions of people are voting in elections this year. So South Korea is just the latest. I mean, probably almost every week there's an election somewhere around the world. So I think the focus from foreign media was naturally on foreign policy. I think some of the coverage, because there are a lot of correspondents here, look, I think if we look at how Yoon approaches foreign policy before the elections and after, I don't think there'll be any major shifts, say, in the next couple months. So a lot of the coverage tend to focus on some of the local color, some of the sort of gladiator politics, the colorful campaigning. Green onions, I think Chung-eun mentioned, were certainly a part where, we were seeing rallies where attendees would be holding green onions in their laps and having posters that said, Yoon remarked how reasonable the prices of green onions were. It was something like the equivalent of 60 cents in the US. And they said 60 cents should be the monthly salary of the South Korean president. So, just like many democracies where there's a lot of political division, not much disagreement, a lot of mudslinging, that's generally good for journalists. We like writing about this type of action, and there are certainly sharp views. This was not an election where people thought, well, I don't really have what do I think about Yoon? Yeah, I guess he's okay. No, there were very clearly strong views for Yoon and against Yoon, and that certainly fed into the election coverage on sort of the ground level. And I think that's where you saw a lot of the election coverage. For us, we actually did a series of stories, maybe more than we should have. I would say even dating back to the 2022 election. I think Celeste had mentioned, I have been based here for several years, but I was surprised at the amount of interest in the presidential election 2 years ago. And that was a miscalculation by me, because between the two candidates with Lee Jae-myung, he would have represented, at least on foreign policy, some continuation of what President Moon had tried to enact. But as we've seen under the 2 years of President Yoon, we've seen dramatic shifts in sort of the posture toward the US, restoring relations with Japan. And that really means a lot to people outside of the country. Inside the country, it was called the race of two unlikables. People didn't really back either candidate. They sort of disliked one more than the other. But I try to keep that in mind as we thought about our legislative coverage. So our walk-up piece, and again, I think for a foreign audience, we're all sort of feeling high, inflation, escalating real estate prices, but these are often very specific to South Korea. So our piece before the election looked at South Korea has the lowest birth rate among wealthy democracies. So we looked at this first time event among the electorate. There were more eligible older voters than there were younger voters for the first time. Now, I think if we actually look at the results, Yoon's party, again, they got shellacked. The opposition, along with the third party, were able to develop a pretty strong coalition. But Yoon's party actually picked up 5 seats. I mean, if you want to start with the presumption that a South Korean president would at some point have legislative control, this was a big for them. But I think he was able to maintain something of a coalition and control. Relative to the last election. He didn't lose seats. His party actually gained seats. even if that was not the public framing. So we looked at this demographic issue. I think the preponderance of older voters who do turn out did help the ruling party on some levels. Again, not going to help when it comes to a National Assembly vote, but I think given the how unpopular he is, I think it did help on the final tally. But day of, we certainly covered the results, and we're writing something today as well on Yoon. He stayed silent for several days after the election, and he addressed the public for the first time. He didn't, very, very interestingly, he did not issue any type of direct apology when he was on TV. It came out after the fact, secondhand, through his cabinet, through presidential officials, and that really strikes. This is the last point I'll make. This really strikes at the Achilles heel for Yoon. I mean, he came in as an outsider, and when he ran for president 2 years ago, he didn't have anything of a track record. A lot of the frustrations and anger that South Koreans felt about the direction of the country could not be pinned on Yoon himself. But it's a different dynamic when you're in charge. You couldn't escape that type of criticism in last week's elections, and I think we saw a different result as that sort of responsibility shifted onto him. And this apology through a spokesperson, I think, sort of points to there's frustration with the ruling class, the ruling political class in many democracies that tends to bring in outsiders. We've seen many outsiders across many democracies, many governments. But when they're in office, so that outsider status, they're not from the establishment. They don't have these long-running alliances. They don't necessarily know who to pick. So we've seen some of this discomfort and awkwardness with Yoon throughout his first 2 years. And I think the benefit of the doubt that he got as a political neophyte disappeared in the elections. So it'll be interesting to see how this projects for him 3 years going forward. We might see, and I think this was the tenor of a lot of foreign coverage, we might see even more of a focus on foreign policy and his relationship with other countries, because really that's the only block he has. That's really the only area he has where he could move the needle. At home, I think he's got any number of proposals to lower taxes, to spur investment, to create jobs. But those plans really have no chance of passing a National Assembly that's very adversarial toward him, and in fact feels emboldened to perhaps set the country in the direction that the opposition party wants to go in. So I think the foreign media, again, it's always one of these interesting dynamics where what we're writing about, what we're focused on, is different than what the issues are for others.
Thank you. I think your earbuds are falling off.
Yes, my earbuds fell out. Yes, sorry about that. But I think I think this actually might be where Yoon's focus lies. Actually, where all the foreign media are focused on in our coverage.
Thank you very much, Tim. After Josh's comments, I would like to touch on a couple of themes that you raised. One was how the elections were conducted. For example, this is some of the highest turnout in 30 years. So what does that mean? How can we interpret that? Also, there were a number of close races. We tend to focus on the leaders, Lee Jae-myung of the DP and Yoon of obviously as a president. But his prosecutor friends leading the PPP have also now resigned. And so what does this mean for this prosecutor politics that Chung-eun mentioned at the beginning? As well, I'd like to ask a little bit about the demographic results and how we interpret them, which Tim also brought up. All right, but I think this gives us a good sense of sort of what some of the foreign reporters in Seoul were covering. Josh, I wanted to turn to your perceptions about what are some of the reactions from foreign governments, U.S. officials, and experts? What are some of the things that have stood out about the elections and expectations for what this means for U.S. ROK relations going forward? And what were some of your views about the elections?
Sure. Thank you so much for including me. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you this morning. I think building off of Tim's comments, I think what I'd like to do just for a few minutes is give you the Washington perspective, not just on these elections, but about how they fit into the overall U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy at this moment in the Biden administration. I think the first thing, just to respond to your question directly, that should be said is that actually these National Assembly elections did not really get much discussion in Washington last week, and that's probably a good thing. If there was some reason that U.S. officials were getting deeply involved in the National Assembly elections in South Korea, that might present all sorts of issues that are actually not really appropriate for the role of the U.S. government, and vice versa. We don't really, like it when a lot of foreign governments get involved in our local elections either. So, in the sense that, it shows that there's a resilience in the Washington Korea watching community toward that enables it to be pretty much okay with no matter which party is controlling the National Assembly. And of course, we've been dealing with the split government in Korea for all this time anyway. That's a good thing in the sense that foreign policy in the U.S. Did not feature prominently domestically in South Korea. That's probably also a good thing. And, in that sense, we can predict a measure of continuity. At the same time, I think when talking to U.S. officials and experts since the election, oh, by the way, we should also mention what was going on in Washington last week. We had a big week in Indo-Pacific strategy, not Korea related, but Japanese Prime Minister was here for a state dinner. There was a trilateral meeting with Japanese Prime Minister and the President of the Philippines. There were some new announcements on AUKUS. And so this showed that despite the ongoing wars in Ukraine and Israel, that there still is a lot of bandwidth for the East Asia and for the Indo-Pacific in Washington. Good things can still happen. And now let me contradict that a little bit by saying that, the downside, of course, is that, all three, when the South Korean president and the Japanese prime minister and the U.S. president meet later this year, and I think this is going to be the sort of the celebratory event of this trilateral alliance. They're going to meet in July on the sidelines of NATO in Washington on the anniversary of the Camp David summit. It will be very apparent to everybody watching that these are three leaders who are in a very weakened position from where they were 1 year ago. Prime Minister Abe is facing a very tough outlook in his September polls. Prime Minister Yoon is perceived rightly or President Yoon is perceived rightly or wrongly as in a weaker position and having less flexibility, as Tim just mentioned, perhaps to do things on the international stage that might be more unpopular, or at least controversial at home. And President Biden is heading into the meat of his general election and really just needs a good economy and copacetic news stories, and he's not getting them. And so that means that points to an increase in the administration's desire for a kind of détente with Beijing, and it points to an increase in the administration's pattern of avoiding things that might be considered provocative in the region, at the same time trying to maintain and, in fact, illustrate the work that it's done over the last 3.5 years to build up these, what it calls a lattice work approach of interlocking, you could say, assorted alliances in the Indo-Pacific, which are, although they don't say this explicitly, meant to hedge and contain and constrain China's regional expansion and aggression. So that's all to say that I think that the foreign policy environment is getting more challenging, not less. I think that over the course of the year, you're going to see the Ukraine war get worse, not better. There's a potential for increase in tensions and more spillover in the Middle East. This places a strain on countries like South Korea, who are helping Ukraine in a number of ways, some overtly and some more discreetly, and places a strain on its relationship with Russia, and a strain on energy resources, energy prices. And overall, there's a sense in Washington that we're heading towards a much more complicated, dangerous, risky, and perhaps violent portion of this ongoing struggle that doesn't directly involve East Asia, but at some point could involve East Asia more directly. So I just think that's a broad picture of sort of how the administration looks at these relationships. And I think there's a feeling around Washington, especially on Capitol Hill, that while a lot of the progress that has been made in building these sort of mini-lateral groupings is positive on the strategic side, that there's still a lack of real credible portions of the economic and investment side of the strategy. I think there's a sense on Capitol Hill in both parties, actually, that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that the Biden administration put out lacks a robust implementation, and that while some of the economic and industrial cooperation policies have proceeded, such as investment in semiconductor manufacturing, which benefits South Korean industry, it benefits American industry, it increases the ability of both countries to de-risk from China and to reorient supply lines. At the same time, there are a lot of parts of the technological and economic and investment part of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy that have not worked out as well as they had hoped. And on issues like outbound investment restrictions and technology export restrictions to China, these are things that are still very much up in the air, especially between allies like the US and South Korea, and will continue to be. And I don't think the Biden administration ever really came up with any North Korea policy to speak of. You could call it a strategic patience, but that would do a disservice to the word strategic, because I think it's just really patience. And I think that is unsustainable. And so in that kind of environment where the administration really has done all of the things that it's going to be able to do for the first term, and is now placing a priority on trying to keep things quiet while things are getting less and less quiet, I think that could present unpredictable challenges for the U.S.-South Korea relationship over the next few months, especially toward the end of the year, when all of the bad actors have more of an incentive to create bad things in the world to make the United States elections and political process more complicated at the worst possible time. And that inevitably leads anyone to contemplate, okay, well, what happens if Biden loses? Because if he wins and he comes back, well, then they can sort of take a look at all of these things again and start afresh and have some time to work on them. But if Trump comes back, the only thing that's certain is unpredictability. And, my view on unpredictability, having covered 4 years of Trump administration policy, especially in the Indo-Pacific, is that it's only useful if it's intentional. And with President Trump, it often wasn't. And for alliances, that can be 100% bad. And if we can just remember quickly some of the things that happened, I'm sorry to remind everybody of these things because they're excruciating, but just off the top of my head, I remember very distinctly when I was in Seoul in November 2019, and President Trump was essentially blackmailing the South Korean government into increasing its payments for hosting of U.S. troops fivefold. They eventually made a deal, but it was a pretty rude way to go about it. I reported back in 2018 that President Trump was very intent on removing a large number of U.S. troops from South Korea, not for any specific reason other than that's what he decided he thought was the right thing to do, or he thinks it doesn't make economic sense, or whatever it is. And there were a lot of people in that administration that fought a sort of rear guard campaign to stop that from happening, but a lot of those people won't be back. And I think what we're facing in the next Trump administration is not a complete shift towards people who don't care about alliances, especially in East Asia, but an increase of the number of those people versus the number of people who do care about alliances, and many of whom won't be back for a number of reasons. And so that is a very risky situation, not just especially for these unilateral, multilateral organizations, because who knows if Trump would care about any of those, and but especially for these military alliances, because what can be sure is that the Trump administration's second term is going to try to pull up stakes in a lot of different parts of the world, and they're pretty clear about that. Now, beyond that, there's a lot of I wouldn't call them leaks even. I would call them trial balloons being floated in the press by people close to Trump about what his policies would be, especially on the North Korea. You may have seen some of these. I would caution any listener to this or viewer of this webinar to treat those as not credible, for the simple reason that we don't know who's going to be in the administration, so we don't know which sources as journalists are really able to make those kinds of predictions. Some of them are job applications by people who want to reach Trump through the press. this was, again, a familiar pattern in the last Trump administration that I'm hoping not to repeat, but let's see. But I think what we can predict is that, Trump's pattern consistently over time is not to go in and to concede large foreign policy points to adversaries. I think that's kind of more of a cartoonish depiction of his strategy. What he thinks, and I've talked to him personally about this, is that you have to escalate to de-escalate. He's likely to take a lot of these specific issues, including Ukraine, including Iran and China and perhaps North Korea, and actually raise the pressure and try to create what he considers to be a position of strength from which to then negotiate a deal. That's what he did with tariffs in the first administration. That's what he did with the Iran deal. That's a lot of different examples. Afghanistan, just to name a few, Russia. So again, that doesn't mean that that strategy works. That doesn't mean that it will be implemented with any sort of skill. But that's a general guide for how I, as a foreign policy columnist covering the Trump administration, think about the way that he thinks about these things, given all of the other externalities. So I just think I'll stop here, but I would just like to end by saying that, I think that the Biden administration has done a good job with working with the South Korean governments that it has encountered, and I think that they'll continue to do so. But they don't control the externalities that I just mentioned, and those externalities have a way of imposing themselves exactly when you don't want to. And I think the risk around the region is just going way up, and our ability to respond to that risk due to our domestic political dysfunction here in Washington is going way down. And that's the thing that I'm most concerned about coming out of this election in Korea and heading toward the election in Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Josh. You paint a bit of a dark picture, but I think
that was the idea. That was the idea.
In some sense, the question of how the next couple of months foreign policy will be for the Yoon administration depends a little bit, as you said, on the November elections here in Washington, D.C. and their outcome. So I did want to ask Heejun if you had any responses to Josh's comments on the foreign policy questions before we turn back to the domestic issues of these Korean elections.
Sure. Thanks for Josh for your just insightful discussions. Actually, you mentioned about the last week's U.S. and Japan summit and U.S. Japan and Philippines summit as a very meaningful and very important things in the Indo-Pacific regions. But sorry. So I would like to ask about the U.S. position on the U.S.-Japan relationship. Actually, as you mentioned, in the recent U.S.-Japan summit, the two countries evaluate their military cooperation to the highest levels. But in Koreans' view, this raises concern that the U.S. is enabling Japan's militarization and allows it to become a war-fighting nations. From the U.S. government's perspective, is the support for Japan's military buildup motivated by the desire to counter China? Actually,
Yes.
I would like to, yes.
Thank you so much for this question. I traveled to Tokyo last year and I interviewed Prime Minister Kishida about his plan to double the Japanese budget, defense military budget, from 1% to 2% over the next 5 years. And to me, it seemed somewhat out of character because, of course, Kishida was from the more liberal side of the LDP. And, traditionally, this was a plan that was hatched by more conservative elements like his predecessor, Shinzo Abe. But what Kishida said to me was that, a leader doesn't get to choose the time that he leads in, and that he has to do what he thinks is necessary. Now, traveling around Tokyo, I also encountered many officials who had a similar view, which was that these moves by Japan, not just the defense spending, but taking on offensive strike capabilities, backfilling U.S. Patriot missiles, making nice with Korea, taking a stronger stance vis-a-vis, taking more military operations with the Philippines, a stronger stance in the South China Sea, that all of these things are actually driven from the Japanese side, not the US side. And the reason I believe that is because, of course, the US side has been asking Japan to do all of these things and more for decades, but they didn't do it. And I think, again, just, spending time in Japan and talking to officials and people from different parts of the system, it's very clear to me that the Russian attack on Ukraine changed something fundamentally inside of the Japanese society and political discussion that is a big reason why you're seeing a lot of these changes, and for Japan to change its relationship with Russia in such a stark way. Again, this is not something that Washington has the power or really ability to convince Japan to do. And so I think if you're asking me about how U.S. officials think about this, I think they're very happy about it. Don't get me wrong. And at the same time, they understand that Japan and South Korea are two different countries with two different situations who are going to have distinct relationships with China that are not going to follow the same pattern. And I think the Biden administration is right to try to meet each ally where they are at and urge them to do more things that we think that the United States thinks is in the mutual interest of both countries. And although we don't say it, we're trying to contain China. We don't use that word in government, but that's essentially the mission. I think if we're being honest as intellectuals, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to contain China's aggression and expansion in the region. And every country will do different things based on their domestic political situation. But no, I don't think Japan's changes are driven by Washington. Otherwise, they would have done it 30 years ago. I think they're driven from Japan and celebrated and encouraged by Washington. And I also, as a columnist, have no problem telling you that I think that they're prudent, because if you compare these military moves by Japan to the military moves on the Chinese side, it's not even close. Chinese military expansion and build up and nuclear build up and it's many times that of what Japan did. So even though Japan has now done something unprecedented in terms of increasing its military commitments and its military resource allocations, compared to China, it's very little. And so there's just simply, and the U.S. government is not, we can't anticipate big defense budget increases. Our defense budget is huge already. It's about as big as it can really be. So the only real way to, in my view, to maintain deterrence is for many, many, many countries to participate in, unfortunately, what is looking like an arms race, but not an arms race that was driven by Washington, an arms race that was driven by Beijing. This was Xi Jinping's decision to drastically, hundreds and hundreds of new nuclear warheads and delivery systems. What explains that, and the aggression in the South China Sea, what should we do about that? Nothing. No, I think the demand signal is coming from the region, and I think that this is a response to China's efforts, not a provocation toward China. Thank you.
May I
Yes,
add
please.
one more comment or something?
Go ahead.
Actually, I agree that the arms race is driven by China, actually. And as all we know, the US and Korea both recognize that our alliance has become stronger than ever before. And Korea is expected to play the role of ally that shares the value of liberal democracy while strengthening security cooperation with the U.S. amid the U.S.-China conflict in the Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned. In this context, the U.S. is intensifying its effort to counter China. As a result, it is further expanding multilateral alliances such as AUKUS and the Quad and Five Eyes to address China challenges. Recently, AUKUS has officially confirmed the possibility of expanding military cooperation with Japan, as you know, and there have also been a report that Korea could be included as a pillar 2 of AUKUS. Regarding this, could you please explain the position within the U.S. government and political circles, and to the extent as you are aware of them? And then I would like add one more thing. Korea is in a situation where it needs to manage its relationship with China alongside strengthening security cooperation with the US and its allies. And this process, it will be important for Korea to minimize the deteriorations of its ties with China and pursue a balanced diplomatic approach. So what is your thought on this?
Is this for me again?
Yes.
Okay.
Josh or more.
I'll just give a very, very quick answer. So, I do think that U.S. officials have been pretty clear that Japan is intended to be part of Pillar 2 of AUKUS. And I think this is just one of many examples of Japanese military and SDF increased operational and training and integration with lots of U.S. Partner forces in the region. I think that Japanese and the Philippines will sign an agreement that will allow not really basing of Japanese troops, but at least enough legal authority for Japanese troops to train on Filipino soil with the U.S. And I think that's a big step. I think there's a big shift to move and preposition resources more towards Japan's Southwest Islands. That this is, the unspoken part of this is preparing for a Taiwan contingency. And that's, again, something the U.S. government guys don't talk about publicly, but it's obvious. Everybody knows that it's right now where it's South China Sea, and tomorrow it's about Taiwan contingency. And of course, the idea is to increase the deterrence to prevent the attack. And that's the theory of it. And Japan has been a full partner. Now, I don't criticize South Korea because I think it's just a totally different situation. And I don't think anyone expects South Korean military to play a big role in a Taiwan contingency, or at least in the buildup of deterrence to prevent a Taiwan contingency. Although we have to be honest again that in the event of a war over Taiwan, South Korea could become involved very, very, very quickly. Due to retaliation or in re-retaliation, and if North Korea gets involved, et cetera. So it's not as if we can ignore South Korea's role in that contingency. But I'm just saying, there's nobody in the U.S. government that I talk to who wants to push South Korea to do anything that it doesn't want to do in terms of increased participation in these kinds of military cooperation and operational and technological developments. Now, of course, the door remains open. So, this is wrapped into, of course, the idea that, for South Korea, really, I think a much more prominent concern with China is economic coercion, and that's the weakest part of the U.S. strategy. So my criticism of the Biden administration is that their Indo-Pacific strategy is too militarized and too focused on strategic components and not focused enough on economic and investment components. Although I went through some of those examples, it's a mixed bag to be sure. But when it comes to helping Korea with the thing that it actually needs the most help on, which is resilience against economic coercion, I think there's a lot more that can be done. And, again, because in any democracy, the politics change, and we're seeing this in Australia, just for one example. In the Philippines, the politics changed, and then they changed again. So, I think there's just a very sort of, what I would consider a healthy understanding inside the Biden administration about the realities of South Korea's intention to always be in a different position related to the U.S. and China than some of the other allies, and that's okay. Nevertheless, I would just end by reinforcing my own personal opinion, which is that the aggression from Beijing is only getting worse, even though right now it seems we're in a period of détente and cooperation. And I think the Chinese government has become more adept and skillful in sort of minimizing the backlash to some of its aggressive policies in some cases. In the end, the trajectory is going one way, and that's down. And, so I think independent of what Washington says or independent of who's in charge in South Korea, those inevitabilities will drive a cycle of cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea to counter what will increasingly be problematic aspects of China's rise.
Thank you very much. I certainly think you, both of you gave us a number of issue areas on which the Democratic Party in its emboldened role alongside other opposition parties in the National Assembly, has a tough road ahead in terms of encouraging détente with China or improved economic relations from the position of in control of the National Assembly, but also the realities of what China is doing, as well as other countries like North Korea, as Hee-Jun mentioned, is not responding for the most part. In fact, provoking, I guess, rather than responding to any overtures for dialogue from the Biden administration, or potentially from a shift to the liberal government in South Korea. So I want to remind our audience that we have the Q&A box open, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience. But while we are waiting for those to appear, I would like to shift gears back to the domestic implications of this election. Chongun, if I could ask you a little bit there, aside from the leaders of the parties, there were a number of very close races across the country, and your map showed us that the Southeast remains a conservative stronghold, and the Southwest remains a DP stronghold. What are your interpretations of the high turnout, highest since 1992, and all of these close races, looking ahead to the 2027 presidential election?
Okay, so the turnout was 67% is historically high. And I would rather say that this shows that the liberals themselves and conservatives themselves, they stick together each other. And then because they both cry that, okay, we should judge the other part. I mean, the PPP say that we will and we should judge and punish the big opposition party which blocks every legislative power or control or policies of the Yoon administration, whereas the DP says that let's judge and punish the Yoon administration with their poor ability to make the better life or a better economy and things like that. So they both stick together, and then it was like a really, really harsh battle. So here, there was Lee Jae-myung, and then here, I would rather say President Yoon and then another PPP leader, Han Dong-hoon. Actually, Han Dong-hoon, a prosecutor as well, a very stylish, handsome, and young political leader, once was perceived as savior. I mean, a political hero who could save the PPP. But then there was a lot of problems, the relationship with Han Dong-hoon and the President Yoon got so worse and worse, deteriorating. So it did not work that way. So finally, the election result make Lee Jae-myung, DP leader, helped him regain his political power, strengthen his position as a very strong next presidential candidate. So now he filled his party and the National Assembly with his very closest allies, which will secure him from his legal trial risk. I mean, Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the DP, now under convicted real estate development corruption. So President Trump, he has to go on and on and on about the trial to the court for his own trials. But I think this election make him really now a strong leader, and it will make the Liberal Party stick together more and more. So we still have three years more to go before our Korean presidential election. But this already made our country really polarized. So I think we'll face more challenges from now on.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting parallels between the legal challenges of Lee Jae-myung and candidate former President Trump. So we have a question from the audience. David Kosick asks, beyond the issues that we've already discussed, are there any potential areas of cooperation between the DP and the Yoon administration? Certainly, Chung-eun, your answer just now suggests maybe not. But perhaps on the issues he asks of climate change, energy transition, clean energy shift, maybe even on the foreign policy side, Ukraine.
Okay, so my answer would be quite negative, but of course there are some. I mean, for example, like low birth rate, the serious social problem in Korea, like both the DP and PPP, their policies are quite similar. And for example, when the PPP leader Han Dong-hoon promised to move the National Assembly to the other area, other province from Seoul, like DP kind of agreed. So not many, not much, but there are very like little chances that they can cooperate. And I think now President Yoon should find which policy or which factor, which one that they can cooperate or compromise and or raise his hands to DP to show that now he is ready to cooperate.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, that would require President Yoon to meet with Lee Jae-myung, which has been a challenge so far.
Very important question, and that's exactly the one that the media raised right after the election. And Lee Jae-myung, like in advance, he first suggested his meeting. Actually, he had asked the meeting with the President Yoon already 8 times. But the former prosecutor general, President Yoon, seemed that he did not want to meet the convicted politician. So he kind of been refused. And now the Yongsan presidential office said that, we need more time to like, how can I say, solve our inner problem first, and then maybe we can, but not clear answer yet.
Tim, you mentioned President Yoon's statement today, I believe. Were there any kind of outreach, reading between the lines?
Well, okay. Actually, the speech today at the cabinet meeting was very interesting because after the election, after the defeat, after the failure, everybody wants to hear something from President Yoon himself directly. And he made a speech for 13 minutes today at the cabinet meeting, but it was like, okay, he said that he was sorry, he felt sorry, and he will humbly accept the result of things. But then his thing is like, we did our best, but our policy was right. However, like we tried to make it better, but it's like it kept this way on and on and on. So people now doubt whether it was a real regret or like real feeling sorry, or just he still wants to think himself that, okay, everything was fine, but people didn't understand me. It's like that kind of sentiment. So not easy for him, not easy for Korean people as well, like to understand each other or like go proceed forward.
Yes. Another bleak picture that you paint in some ways. Tim, did you want to add anything to the Chung-eun's response to the statement today?
I think Chung-eun summarized it quite nicely. It was if you were offended, I am sorry that you felt that way. So yeah, I think you wonder what the political framing of this, what the upside is for Yoon. I think people in his own party are saying we were not able to establish beyond our base, and not showing genuine contrition would, the voters just showed with who they chose to give their support to, where their loyalties lie. So what can he do? What should he do to try and expand that if he has any aspiration of a domestic mandate or accomplishment before he leaves office in 2027?
Yeah, and the level of the division in the electorate really seems stark. In the 2022 election, we saw a lot of demographic differences between especially young men and women in which party they supported. Tim, you mentioned some of the demographic challenges about now and older voters outnumbering younger voters. Are there any kind of, as you look at the election results, this is open to all four of you if you want, any takeaways, things that stood out to you about the demographic, both age and gender results?
I might just say quickly, I'm sorry, I might just say very quickly that we actually saw more dramatic breakdown between more defectors, if you will, of young men in their 20s side with Yoon as a presidential candidate in 2022 than we did just a few days ago. The margin of support between the two main parties, conservative and left-leaning, was actually quite narrow. This is exit poll data. I don't know if we have formal results yet, but it was about 1.5 percentage point difference between conservatives had that advantage. It was about 48%. Young men in their 20s supported the opposition party by 46.5% roughly. And I would say the analysts we spoke with before the election said, yes, it's actually quite remarkable how little interest young people are getting from political candidates because they're one of the rare swing voters across the population. They seem to be more focused on policy by policy, given that they're looking to get a job, looking to buy a home, looking to start a family. They have they're sort of in the crosshairs of a lot of the country's woes. You go older than that, people in their later 30s, 40s, 50s, these are the diehards for the opposition party who were able to enjoy democracy and the rise of democracy. And you go older than that, it skews very heavily to the conservatives. And I'm looking at the exit poll data here. Yeah, basically as you go older, it gets redder. As you get younger, it gets bluer. Again, with this sort of unique, shift, I think by young men in their 20s, we do see a difference between how they voted in 2022 when they were just angry at the way the government was. Again, there was a lot of misogyny, there was a lot of pandering to this sort of sentiment. But 2 years later, they've had 2 years of the Yoon administration, and that support waned for the conservatives. So it'll be interesting to see by 2027 if that reverts to any type of historical norm, or if the conservatives somehow are able to bring them back.
Thank you very much. Chong'un, let me turn it over to you and just add how some of these gender questions played out in this election as compared to 2022.
Let me explain this way. Demographically, the team's explanation was right, but I would like to add, we better think in a district factor. I mean, in Seoul itself, we used to have more than almost a 10 million population, and just because of high housing price, people could not afford it. So the young couple kept moving to the suburban part of the Seoul. And then Seoul has 22 districts, whereas the Incheon and Gyeonggi area province, they have much more electoral districts. And there, the DP won their votes because the young couple who faces their financial pressure and the financial problems and hard to live, they just chose DP candidate instead of PPP because they want to have their leader who could for them show other alternatives than the situation right now.
Thank you very much. I hope that answered Adam Bubanich's question. We are virtually out of time now, so we have one more minute if anybody wants to add a final takeaway. But I do want to thank our panelists today for their great insights on this election. I think wide-ranging from the local district level issues on up to the national and foreign policy concerns. Looking ahead, I think it might be a long 3 years. Certainly might feel like a long next 6 months as we look ahead to the US elections. But please join me in thanking our panelists for today, and thank you all for joining online. I really learned a lot from the four of you and appreciate your time. Thank you.